All right, if you want to open your Bibles to the Gospel of Luke, chapter 18. When talking about different characters in the Bible and different groups, we often run across two groups, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And I know early in my Christian life I kind of grouped them together as one, but they're not. They were separate. They were often addressed by both John the Baptist and Jesus. Unfortunately, he didn't have kind words to say to them. So let's look at them tonight. The Pharisees and the Sadducees. Who were they? One definition of the Pharisees were they were separatists. They emerged largely out of the groups of the scribes and the sages. The name Pharisees comes from the Hebrew and Aramaic perush, that's why, or farush, which mean one who is separated. So we know when Jesus talked to them that they considered themselves really separate. It also may refer to their separation from the Gentiles because of their ritual impurity or from irreligious Jews. Probably the most famous Pharisee we know of is the Apostle Paul, who made no bones about the fact prior to his conversion he was a Pharisee. How about the Sadducees? Sadducees is from an Old English Latin word. Hard to translate that, but all the way back in 2 Samuel, you'll remember Zadok, they kind of came, they claimed their descent from there, but later on historians regard them as more of a political party of the priestly class than a religious one. Sadducees and Pharisees. The Pharisees would be considered the conservative group of Jesus' day. They believed in keeping things Jewish. They believed in the resurrection. They believed in the afterlife. They believed in hell. They believed in spirits. They were very traditional. They'd have been the conservatives of Jesus' time. The Sadducees were the liberals. They didn't believe in anything supernatural. So of course they really had a tough time with Jesus. They didn't believe in miracles. They didn't believe in hell. They didn't believe in any afterlife or heaven or anything like that. And they associated more with the wealthy of Jesus' time and even before Jesus' time, whereas the Pharisees were more of the common people. So the Pharisees were conservative, traditional, the Old Testament scriptures only plus oral tradition. The Sadducees were more liberal. They liked to hang out with the wealthy, and they said only the written word. We don't accept any oral traditions. Interestingly enough, I said to Liz on the way here, I said it's so interesting that both of those religious groups, neither of them recognized the Messiah. Neither of them accepted Jesus, and Jesus blasted both of them for different reasons. Let's talk about the Pharisees first. In Luke chapter 18, I think is the best example of what represents Pharisaical thinking and Pharisee type action. It's a familiar story. Verse 10 of Luke chapter 18. Jesus is telling a parable. Now remember, they're there listening to this too. Two men went up to pray, one a Pharisee and the other was a publican. If you didn't know, a publican was a tax collector. They weren't very popular in Jesus' day, not very popular today, because they collected the people's money. So they both went up to pray in this parable. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself, God, I thank thee, I am not as other men are, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, even as this publican. I fast twice a week, give tithes of all I possess. Now the publican. And the publican, standing afar off, would not lift up so much as his eyes to heaven, but smote his breast, saying, God be merciful to me, a sinner. Verse 14, I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone that exalteth himself shall be abased, and he that humbleth himself shall be exalted. This gives a very clear picture of what a Pharisee thought of himself. They were not only just separate, but they were better than. They just thought of themselves, really above anybody else. Here's some facts. As I said, the most popular Pharisee we know about was the Apostle Paul. They actually existed well before Jesus' time, which I'm going to play a clip to show how they came about. I had to be reminded about 6,000 Pharisees at the time of Jesus. Type of spiritual lawyer. Main thing, or one of the main things is this part. They knew the letter of the law, but not the spirit. So they just didn't get what was behind it. And because of that, they would often manipulate the law to suit their needs at the time. As they've been accused by the Lord, they often burden others to strictly adhere to the law in order to benefit themselves. Not only was the Apostle Paul, but one of the early church leaders, Josephus, Gamaliel, Nicodemus, all we would consider to be Pharisees. So that's just a little bit about who they were. They interpreted the Jewish laws. There again, number 12, they were set apart. That's where the word comes from. Very much a feeling of superiority or elite and separatist. Number 13 there. They really thought by their separateness they were it. Popular type of leaders. They sought the people's approval, but they were blind spiritually and rejected Jesus as the Messiah. They were the ones that held an illegal trial at night to condemn him. One of the main things that separated the Pharisees and Sadducees was number 17. The Sadducees absolutely did not believe in anything supernatural, including the resurrection, and so on and so forth. So that's just some facts. I came across this. I want to play this for us tonight. There's two clips. This first one will repeat a little bit of the information, but it puts it very well.
Two of the most common groups mentioned in the New Testament are the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And these two groups of Jewish people were opposed to one another and also set in opposition to Jesus in the Gospels. So let's take a look at what they believed and some characteristics of their groups. So the Pharisees were experts on the law, or the Torah. The Torah is the first 5 books of the Old Testament and includes the laws that were given to Moses and given to the people of Israel. Now the Pharisees were experts, and they also believed not only in the law itself, but in the oral law. And the oral law, they believed, was the gift given to Moses for interpreting the law. So the Pharisees not only believed in the letter of the law, they also believed in the importance of interpreting the law. And so therefore, their focus on the laws made holiness or sanctification possible outside of the temple through following the law. And this is why we have just below the picture of the Pharisee on the left, 2 icons to help remember the characteristics of a Pharisee. One is an image of the Torah on the left, another image of the mouth, to remember that they believed in an oral law, in an interpretation of the laws. And later on, after Jesus died, there was some of the laws and interpretations were written down in important books that were used by Jews for centuries and millennia afterwards, which is why the rabbis of today, the leaders of the Jewish people today, are traced back to the Pharisees. After the temple was destroyed, the Pharisees lived on. In the image of the Pharisee, you can see 2 important things. One is on the hand of the man is a phylactery, and these were boxes that contained the law, contained writings of the law in little boxes, either strapped to their heads or strapped to their hands. And they also wore blue fringes on their mantle. You can see the white garb on his head and around his shoulders. The Sadducees were priests. They were a priestly class, probably traced back to the high priest Zadok. That they considered the temple to be required for holiness. So they were followers of the law, and looking at the parts of the law that talked about sacrifice and the temple, that's what they focused on as their path to holiness. Now, one important thing that was clearly stated in the New Testament was their resurrection was, according to them, resurrection was not going to happen, that there was no afterlife, that there was no resurrection of the dead, which clearly would be opposed by Christians who Jesus was risen from the dead, so Sadducees would have rejected that belief. And they were more upper class. They were associated with the ruling class of the Palestine, of Israel, of the Greeks who were ruling the area. So the two icons to help you remember what they were all about are the image of the temple on the left below the picture, and then an image of a gravestone, and just to remember that they don't believe in the resurrection and they don't believe in an afterlife. So these two groups were actually quite opposed to one another. It probably isn't as clear in the New Testament that they were really rejecting one another in their beliefs. So they were very different in what they believed. Of course, on the left, the Pharisees accepted the law as the path to holiness, and the Sadducees focused on the temple. And of course, when the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, the Sadducees, their path to spirituality was more or less dying away, and which is why the Pharisees were able to live on, and the synagogues were able to be so important in Judaism. So the differences between the two of them are kind of what we talked about already: the interpretation of the Torah versus the Torah alone, resurrection of the dead versus no resurrection, a belief in an afterlife for the Pharisees and no afterlife. So the differences between these two groups and Jesus is Jesus was often projected as opposed to Pharisees because the Pharisees accepted strict interpretation of the law, and Jesus was saying that it's not legalism, but himself, he's the fulfillment of the law. And for the Sadducees, Jesus is of course resurrected from the dead, but he also described himself as the temple. He was even killed for saying that the temple would be destroyed and rebuilt in 3 days. So these two groups were important groups of the New Testament, and important to understand why Jesus was rejected by the Jewish people during his ministry.
So you see, the two classes of folks that influenced Jewish thinking the most, neither one of them liked Jesus. Neither one of them had anything in common with him. No wonder both John the Baptist and Jesus didn't have very kind words to say to the Sadducees and Pharisees. John the Baptist called them a brood of snakes. Now here again, these were groups that were trying to follow what they thought was right, but boy, they just missed the mark. And because they had, in the New Testament, they had the common enemy, was the gospel in Jesus, we don't get to see how much they opposed each other. That's why I thought the historical record, when we read over them, I mean, 88 times their names come in front of us, and this helps us to realize, okay, the Pharisees, they stayed. That's where the Jewish rabbis are today. The Sadducees did not last. They died all out around 73, 77 AD. They had no doctrine. They had no centralized government. So they didn't really last, but groups of rabbis today can directly trace themselves back to the Pharisees because they had a strong belief in things that we would agree with today, and yet, again, both groups missed the Messiah. Both groups did not consider Jesus to be who he was. So because of that, he didn't have very kind words to say to them, nor they toward him. Remember, another interesting New Testament happening was in the temple. They would, let me see if I can pull it up. They would come to make their offering, and it would not be accepted. And at one point, Jesus had to clear the temple out with a whip because they were taking advantage of the people. The people would come in to make their offering, and the Sadducees in particular would look at their offering and say, no, that's not good enough. You need to buy one from me. I've got this nice turtle dove over here without blemish, and of course for a fee. So both groups were greedy. Both groups wanted to make money. That's what angered Jesus so much that we see him uncharacteristically grabbing a whip and clearing the temple out, because they were taking advantage of people. And again, they had their common enemy in the New Testament was Jesus. So we don't see the hostility toward one another that they had. They really didn't get along. On another Wednesday, we'll talk about the Sanhedrin, but just so you know, the Sanhedrin was some of the Pharisees and some of the Sadducees. Let's get together and make a council and they were combined by both groups, and they made decisions. See, the Romans said, you know what, we'll let the Jews have a little bit of power. We don't want to be bothered with their trivial arguing over what we consider to be unimportant things, especially their religion. So, hence we read about the Jewish leaders and the Pharisees and the Sadducees. We'll let you rule your own people, but what we won't accept is any disrespect to Rome and taxes and Caesar. Other than that, you take care of your religious stuff and the people. So that's what these two groups did. So, a lot of the people, even though Jesus did miracles and wonders and good, the two groups that should have been his biggest cheerleaders were anything but. So the people had a tainted view of Jesus because their religious leader says he's bad. We don't believe in him. He doesn't follow Moses. He says he's God. You can just see how these groups build it up. And it was all because they didn't want to lose their position as being the leaders. Well, when did that start? Let me play one other short clip. Now this goes by pretty fast, but this has I encourage you to take a look at the timeline under it while he's speaking, because this goes back to the temple, and this is just a regular guy, and he just tells a quick story of where they came from. It's not facts and figures, it's kind of where they came from.
This is my best attempt at quickly explaining who the Pharisees and the Sadducees are in the New Testament.
See the timeline at the bottom?
To understand this, we actually have to go back to the Old Testament to get the beginnings of the story. The Jewish people had had a kingdom for a long time, but in the second half of the Old Testament, stuff started going south. And the Assyrians, a big mean people group from up north, came down and conquered them, and killed and hauled off into captivity most of the Jewish people. Then the Babylonians came along in the beginning of the 500s BC, and they finished the job. So there's no kingdom left in Israel, and the Babylonians now own what's left of the Jewish people, but then along come the Persians from Iran, modern day, and they defeat the Babylonians, and now they own the Jewish people. The Persians are a little bit nicer, and so they decide they're going to allow the Jewish people to go back to Jerusalem, rebuild the city walls around that town, and rebuild their temple. Now, they won't let the Jewish people have their own king, but they will let the Jewish people govern themselves to an extent using their own religious law. So what that means is you need a new kind of leader to come along and interpret the law and figure out how to enforce the law, which is tricky because it's a religious law that you're trying to use to govern a people in its entirety. And so legal scholars come along and they grow and develop their own tradition that we'll get back to in a minute. Well, the Persian thing doesn't last long because Alexander the Great, who's Greek or Macedonian, comes and conquers the Persians, including Jerusalem and the Jewish people in the process. And Alexander's reign is very short-lived, but when he dies, his general Ptolemy takes control of the Jews in Jerusalem. And Ptolemy has the same vision for the world that Alexander did. He wants to Greekify everything. He wants people to speak Greek, he wants Greek philosophy to catch on, Greek culture to catch on. So he's pretty pushy with that, which is off-putting to the Jewish people who really like the idea of having their own kingdom again someday, and being more Greek and less Jewish feels like a step in the wrong direction. Well, give it a little bit of time, and Ptolemy eventually loses control of Judea, Jerusalem, the Jews, etc., to the descendants of another one of his rival generals, a guy named Seleucus. And the Seleucids are even more ambitious in their desire to snuff out the Jewish thing and replace it with Greek culture. Well, by this point, things are really getting tense in Israel, and some of the people start to say, like, we're not going to do these Greek things. And so the leaders, particularly one Greek leader named Antiochus Epiphanes, pushes back. He's like, no, we're going to get rid of the Jewish thing. We're going to take it even as far as me sacrificing a pig on the altar to your God. We're going to take it as far as you having to offer incense or different offerings to gods you don't believe in, or even to me. Well, the Jewish people are pretty bent out of shape, and they all get summoned to an event where they're supposed to do this sacrificing, and a dude volunteers to do it who's Jewish, and some other Jewish guys are like, no. And they kill the Jewish dude who was going to sacrifice, and it sparks this whole big giant rebellion called the Maccabean Rebellion. Long story short, the Jews win this thing, and they reestablish their own kingdom briefly in the 2nd century BC that lasts a ways into the 1st century BC. And this isn't really a restoration of their old kingdom, because it's not the descendants of the great King David, who's the famous Golden Age king of Israel that everybody wanted to see reestablished, or his line reestablished. But they got something. Well, they also still have a need to make sense of the laws that they're trying to govern their people with. So that's a little bit clumsy. But further, you've got a whole bunch of people, after 200 years of Greekicizing Jewish culture, who really think that in order to be on the right side of history, we need to be more Greekish. You also have a whole bunch of other people who are hyper-conservative, and they're saying, no, the thing that Israel always got wrong when we got into trouble was that we acted more like everybody else and we didn't act like a unique, set-apart people. And it sounds good. And so they argue for these conservative values and a rejection of all of the Greek stuff. Well, it's a culture war. Some people are trying to lean forward, and some people are trying to get back to our roots and really make Israel great again. I'm not trying to take a side here, but if you catch my overtones, it's not that different from a lot of the tensions we feel today. Well, the liberal, legal, philosophical ruling party comes to be known as the Sadducees. They reject a lot of the supernatural teachings of the Old Testament. They don't believe in things like the resurrection of the dead, or miracles, or angels, or spirits, or any of that stuff. They're very, very practical, and they view religion as something that can help provide some guidance socially, that can help steer people morally a little bit, maybe make the world a bit better place. But it's not transformative per se, and it certainly is not overwhelmingly supernatural. The Pharisees, on the other hand, these guys are really into rules, but not just for themselves. You can respect the guy who says, hey, I'm going to be really rigorous and do all this stuff. They had careful, detailed interpretations of the law, and it wasn't just them who needed to obey that, but force needed to be used so that everyone would obey their version of the Jewish religion, so that the Jews could get it right, and so that, once again, they could make Israel great again. Well, it's pretty hard to imagine how these two positions can be reconciled. One rejects a bunch of supernatural stuff, the other believes all of it. One says there's no such thing as resurrection, the other says there is. And they want to see a completely different cultural outcome for their people. So they fight about this a whole bunch, and they have to fight under the same roof, which is kind of clumsy. They've got this organization called the Sanhedrin, and it's a governing council that ranged between 20-some people and 70-some people at its height, that involved a lot of these legal and religious scholars getting together to make decisions, many of which were binding at different points in history, about what ought to happen. Well, there were power shifts from time to time, and at the time of Jesus, we're talking the mid-20s to late 20s AD, you've now got a Pharisee-dominated council with a strong Sadducee minority. And the Pharisees are really grouchy at Jesus because they feel like he is not into the rules nearly enough and doesn't understand what it's going to take to get back to our Jewish roots and make things right. The Sadducees don't like Jesus very much because they think that he's on board with all of this fancy schmancy religious supernatural stuff, and he's doing miracles that they really wish he wasn't doing because it's devastating to their position. So, what's interesting is that this age-old left, right, conservative, liberal thing that is going on in Israel is put on hold for just a few minutes so that these two sides can unify to make sure that they execute Jesus and many of his followers. So, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, together form the Sanhedrin, and these two groups are roughly the equivalents of our liberals and our conservatives, one wanting to make the world much more Greek and or Roman, the other wanting to make the world much more religiously Jewish. Hopefully that's helpful. If you have more questions, put them in the comment section, and I'll try to come up with something that sounds marginally intelligent. I'm Matt.
Okay, so that gives us, between all of those, that gives us an idea. And hopefully all of us, when we read the New Testament the next time, and we see them trying to trick Jesus with a question, for instance, and never being successful at it. They felt threatened by him. And Jesus was constantly, he was trying to be nice, but he wasn't letting them get away with anything. He was calling out their hypocrisy. So both groups that should have recognized Jesus as the Messiah missed it. I mean, they just totally missed it. One piece of scripture about the Pharisees, or another one rather, is in Mark chapter 10. They tried to trick Jesus with this question. In Mark chapter 10, verse 2, it says, "The Pharisees came to him and asked, 'Is it lawful for a man to put away his wife?'" Now that we know a little more about them, we see the intent behind their questions. They didn't like him. They wanted him off the scene, both groups, for different reasons. He answered and said to them, "What did Moses command you?" "Moses allowed us to write a bill of divorcement and put her away." Jesus said in verse 5, "For the hardness of your heart wrote he this precept. From the beginning of creation, God made male and female. And for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and the twain shall be one flesh, and they shall be no more twain but one flesh. Wherefore what God hath joined together, let no man put asunder." And in the house his disciples asked him again the same matter, and he said, "Whosoever put away his wife and marry another committeth adultery against her. And if a woman put away her husband and be married to another, she committeth adultery." So they were trying to trick him. And this was a good scripture to show that it didn't work, of course. And no matter what the Sadducees came up with, and no matter, if they said there was no resurrection, Mark chapter 12, Luke chapter 20, Acts 23, all throughout now we see when these different groups were trying to trick Jesus or question him, they had motives involved. And they weren't pure motives either. He was a threat to them. He was a threat to their power, their influence. People looked up to them. And as we know, all of a sudden now, a miracle worker comes out of Nazareth, comes on the scene, begins to teach with authority. Remember, the Bible says he taught as one having authority, not as like the scribes and the Pharisees. So there's something different about Jesus' teaching than the way they had taught. And as we saw, historically, they had been around before Jesus. They had actually thought themselves, hey, we're the ones, we're restoring Israel to greatness after the burning of the temple and the destruction. We're gonna bring the Jewish state back. And of course, we learned a little bit tonight about the Greek influence, and now we see why Paul took that topic on during his life also. So, a little bit about the Pharisees and the Sadducees, just to freshen us up, and I'll bet the next time we read something in our Bible study or personal study or hear a sermon, now we'll have an idea. This is why they were trying to trick him. This is why they were asking him such a tough question. This is why he called them, "You're of your father the devil," in John chapter 8, "and the lusts of your father you'll do." They tried to claim Abrahamic salvation. And he said, "No, you're of your father the devil." So that was Jesus' answer. And they missed it. Both groups.